Welcome, Andy.
Ed, thanks very much. Can you hear me at the back? Good. So, we've got a rapid visual extravaganza over the next 30 minutes to try and elevate you from the post-lunch slump. So, today I'm talking about this idea of the opposite, the fact that opposites attract, this idea that data visualization, theory and practice is rooted in kind of dualities, things that come together in this unique convergence of worlds. Very quickly, a quick outline of who I am and what I do. So I run the website visualizingdata.com, which has been going since 2010. And on that, I use the platform to share the best new developments and articles and projects and tools and all those sort of things on there. I'm also a design architect and consultant. I travel around everywhere doing training courses. That's not officially my private jet. I'm also recently an author. An award-winning author. My in-laws said it was the best book of last week. But really, I'm interested in this idea of creativity. And I live currently in Hebden Bridge. And about a month ago, Hebden Bridge was voted in the Times as the coolest place in Britain to live. Not linked to temperature, just cool as in the vibe. And you may not be able to see the words there, but who lives here? Question mark. Creative types and those with a hippie streak. And I'll use that as a reference for later on when I come back to this idea of how we try and connect visualizations to people. But those of you who are interested in visualization will be aware that it's a very rapidly evolving, changing and developing field. We've got all sorts of creative, innovative techniques being developed week in, week out. But one of the key questions that a lot of people ask, and a lot of people ask me, is what's good, what's bad? What's the right way to do things, what's the wrong way to do things, and why? And it's always a difficult question to answer because of this idea that the opposites are in this field. So the idea that we've got artistry, creativity, matched and fused together with science, mathematics, statistics, and analysis. And in many respects, it's quite an awkward marriage. And at the root of a lot of the debates and the discussions that take place in the field is this lifelong argument about form and function, style and substance. And it's important to be kind of aware of the nuances of this discussion. Now, anyone who's familiar with the best practice ideas of visualization will be kind of nodding in agreement with this quote from Robert Cassara, who runs the website Eager Eyes. It's a common mistake to think that charts are just a fancy way of showing numbers. They're not. They're tools for understanding. So it's not about making things look cool, to certain eyes, that is. So this bendy 3D slopey bar chart thing going on, it's technically cool, but it's effectively not a successful way of conveying numbers. Sky Sports coverage of any sport, frankly, is lumbered with these gratuitous, fancy, cool techniques, but absolutely impenetrable as modes of communication. What we're trying to do with visualization is unlock the insights and the discoveries that would otherwise be hidden in the raw format and in statistics alone. This project is a great example of something that achieves that. This is a project called Posted by Derek Watkins, and this is essentially a story of social expansion in the US, told through the story of post offices between the 1700s right through to 1900. So the headline statistic is 13,000 post offices opened between those two dates. But the story is unveiled through this portrayal of every single geopoint there, revealing the densities on the east side, that very exciting moment when the first post office opens in the west, but also the stories of things like the railroad patterns that emerge. All these things that would be otherwise locked and hidden in the raw format alone. So this idea of form versus function is, as I said before, where all the arguments take place in the field. There are some, and this is by no means picking on people, but just characterising different views, but there are some that believe that visualisation done right is much more about the science than an art. And it's about studying and obeying human perception. So things like these very kind of sober, pragmatic scatter plots allow people to read accurately and precisely the values that are presented there. People like Jock McKinley, who was very influential behind the development of Tableau software. He believes that visualization when it's effective, is measured by how readily one can perceive the values from the portrayals. So the ease at which we can demonstrate that people can read accurately things like bar charts through the length of a bar is an example in his view of what effective visualization is. And they're absolutely right. Both those two people and the people that kind of follow those ideas are absolutely right and legitimate. But there's another camp, and a very important camp to recognise. This quote from Amanda Cox, who's a very important name in the field. She's the graphics editor at the New York Times. She talks about this project, which I'll show you in a second. But the idea, we've now got some sense of emotion, this idea of feeling data, feeling a story that a data is represented in a visual way. She was referring to this project, which was the US Census map, called Map in America, which the New York Times developed, I think 2 years ago now, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And she articulated in this interview that she knew the communities of New York. She knew how the spread of populations were generally allocated geographically. But this just had that extra sense of a story to it, the clusters of communities, the difference between where people live and don't live, the kind of residential and commercial properties. So this just created a more emotional connection to the story that she otherwise knew. But also taking the very extremes of the field and the concepts around visual portrayal of data. People like Chris Jordan, who's actually a photographer. And there's a very good TED talk that he gave where he talks about this idea that he has a fear that we aren't feeling enough from data, all these huge numbers, these vast quantities, that when they're portrayed in something analytical and pragmatic like a bar chart or a line chart, we don't quite get that connection. So he creates these huge kind of murals in galleries, and this is just a viewer to zoom in. So it starts off as an image of Van Gogh's Starry Night, but you then zoom in, you see that all the pixels of colour are made up of gaslighters. And this is portraying 50,000 gaslighters to represent the amount of floating plastic in a given square mile of the world's oceans, to try and engender some sense of shock at this great environmental footprint of our consumerism. That otherwise, if it was in a bar chart, for example, with 50,000 on the label, we won't quite get that same connection to it. We may, from this, feel a sense of shame, a sense of reaction, a sense of changing our behaviours and patterns of activity. So all these contrasting and almost competing views are expressed in the field. And the question is, well, who's right? Well, actually, they're all right, and it's this idea of horses for courses. Some solutions are suitable for certain contexts, others are not. And it's important to realise this kind of spectrum of different stylistic ways that we can portray data. And it's important to remember that essentially visualisation is a form of communication, a medium of communication. And if we think about the comparisons with things like writing styles. So this is a screen grab from kind of a health and safety workplace, general safety rules type poster that we've all seen, but the language, the style of that writing is formal, it's instructive, it's sober, and that's suitable for the context of what it's trying to get across and how it wishes to get that across. By contrast, any piece of fiction, I mean, this is actually an excerpt from the book On the Road by Jack Kerouac. It's creative, it's natural, it's kind of organic, it's about stories, it has superfluous language to decorate the delivery of that story. And so we can draw experiences from comparisons with things like writing into visualization. And the key question that I ask people to think about is this idea of this trade-off. What's most important? Is it about the accuracy of the interpretation? Or is it about something about the aesthetics and the connection to the visual? Is it about pragmatism versus emotion? Have you got a captive audience, in which case you don't really need to work hard to grab their attention? Or do you need to do something a little bit different to get across that message? Is it about people being able to read data or feel data? This idea of science and art. On the science side, it's all about understanding the basis of the subject, which is rooted in cognitive science. And the idea of visual perception, which is about understanding how the brain and the eye work together to most effectively process shapes and images and patterns. So that's the brain. At the back of the brain, you've got the visual cortex in charge of seeing. Very fast, very efficient, very effective. At the front, by contrast, the cerebral cortex, it's much more slow. It's more ponderous, less efficient. What we're trying to do with visualization on a kind of pragmatic level is exploit the speed of that part of the brain, the seeing functions, and leave the thinking to the consequences. What have we learned? What are our actions, our responses to what we've just learned? Rather than thinking, how on earth do I read this? What does that shape mean? What does that legend mean? And the developments in the field of the last 30, 40, 50 years on the science side have really kind of gathered momentum. So the first person to theorize about how we perceive a sense of a hierarchy of the most effective methods to portray data in terms of how accurately we can read the values, Jacques Bertin with his book Sémiologie graphique. We can edit that French accent later, of course. He was the first person to develop this hierarchy. And his work was taken on by Cleveland and McGill, and more recently by John McKinley. But we've now got a sense of this hierarchy. What's the best way to portray data when accuracy is the important measure? And that's what explains the reasons why, for example, our eyes are far more capable of judging the length of a bar and to compare the lengths of bars than to judge and compare the size of circles. We've also got to be aware of the ground in terms of cognitive science and things like the Gestalt laws, a school of psychology which in 1912 once again were pioneers in theorizing how we, in our eyes and brains, process signals and shapes and patterns. And that leads us to understand things like the relationship between foreground and background. This was a piece of work done for the Euro Championships last summer to show penalty kick analysis, where players were placing their shots. But the amount of noise in the background, the crowd, the nets, the advert hoardings, it prevents the eye very easily and effectively separating what is data, the footballs, and what is noise. And that comes from that understanding from the Gestalt laws all the way back over 100 years ago. We've also got to be aware of things like illusions, about the way that we can misinterpret relative size. So those two orange circles are exactly the same size, but the contrasting shapes around them create this sense of distortion in how we interpret the true size. I'm not quite sure how well this will work, probably not very well, but this is an illusion which shows the way that we can perceive different things close up to how we perceive the same thing far away. Just to be clear, if it's not quite worked up there, that's a kind of fusion of Marilyn Monroe and Albert Einstein. And when it's small, you can see Marilyn Monroe. When it's big, you can see Albert Einstein. It also explains visual perception, why things like 3D portrayals of data are essentially ineffective, or at least distorted. This is a diagram that Drew Scow developed, just to show that when you flip and you sort of bend the portrayal of data into this 3D landscape, it introduces this front step, which distorts the amount of, in that case, grey that we see for that bottom segment. So it makes us instantly think that there's more grey than there is red or blue, whereas the 2D portrayal is truly representative of the values and the size of those values. So all these kind of scientific foundations explain the most effective ways when your priority is to allow people to read data, and to read data effectively and accurately. So things like bar charts, things like the precision of slope graphs, candlestick charts. These are all very kind of pragmatic, analytical ways of portraying data. But on the other side, obviously, as we've just alluded to, is this imperative to appreciate the creative elements of the potential for visualization. The journalistic instinct to tell stories, to find a really important angle about a subject matter, and to get that across in a very effective and metaphorical way. The ability of, in particular, journalist organisations to tell stories, to isolate the important messages and get them across in a very elegant, static way. The design sensibility of that kind of instinct that you can't really teach, but you develop over time. This is a great example from Moritz Stephan, who's a fantastic designer from Germany. He was developing this piece to show the comparisons and combinations of muesli ingredient sales in Germany. The first version on the left, this kind of matrix chart, was the first version he created, but he stepped back and thought, you know, that doesn't look edible. It looks like fungus. It doesn't feel consistent with the metaphor of the subject. So he created that core diagram on the right, which looks like a food bowl. It looks more edible. In effect, in choosing that option, he dropped down the accuracy level. He sacrificed the ease at which we can interpret and combine these readings with something that just introduces a little bit more of the aesthetic judgments. The design sensibility to create things that, once again, metaphorically feel consistent with the subject matter. This is the wind map that was very prominent last year. This is me trying to get my cursor right in the eye of the storm. But it looks like wind. It's consistent, that very instinctive design sensibility to create something that looks like the subject matter. And of course, technical skills, illustration skills, this wonderful graphic from the South China Morning Post. A beautiful illustration in its own right, as well as a wonderful way of portraying and telling a story about data. Conceptual skills, the ability to sketch and conceive ideas. Art direction, so the actual execution, the layout and arrangement, this is all very much an artistic sensibility. And going back to the On the Road mentioned before, this is a piece of work that was done by Stephanie Posavec, who was based in London, and she went through the entire book and coded up all the different sections and categories of language and sentence and chapters and created this organisation hierarchy diagram to show and express that book in a completely different way. Conceptual thinking. And ultimately, the importance of technology. Cannot get away from technology. This is a very powerful tool that was developed by NASA to plot the world's oceans, the patterns of ocean movement and cycles around the world. Also these days we see some wonderful interactive pieces. So the importance of things like usability, experience design. This is a piece done for the New York Times to allow users to find their own combinations and permutations for those 9 key swing states. We've also got fun, the importance of fun. To engage people to play around and to click and to drag and move around. Once again, this is a scenario tool that allowed you to work out the potential different combinations if these swing states went to Romney or Obama, and you can see the smile and the grimace there as things move on. And as you play with this, it feels like bubble wrap. It's that enjoyment factor. You play with it, you drag it. And that's an important aesthetic quality to try and get across into these things that keeps people playing with it and engaged. And so this is about feeling data, about having an emotional connection to the story, being attracted to what you're looking at. This is a prop from a magazine article, but it stops people turning over the page because there's something visually interesting. The visual elegance of the example of the stream graph from the New York Times to show the ebb and flow, the consistency of that metaphor, the ebb and flow of box office takings. The power of colour, obviously, but also a very striking emotional subject matter. This may not come up very clearly. This is a project that some of you may have seen, which create this very powerful conceptual idea about the sense of a life arc. So all those people murdered through gun violence in 2010 in the US, each individual person was portrayed through an arc of their potential life, using big data to simulate the likelihood of how long they would live. But then halfway through, their lives are ended, and the life drops to the bottom, and you create this very powerful story over time, as all these stolen years are calculated from the consequence of gun crime. So how do we resolve all these important style distinctions? Well, it's a very boring answer, a very safe answer, but it always depends. The real craft about visualization is being able to rationalize the choices that we make within the context in which we're working. All those very important environmental factors. How long have I got to do this thing? How many people? What financial resources have we got? What technical resources have we got? Who is the audience? Is it somebody who's a domain expert? Or is it a layperson that might need a little bit more help to understand a piece? What's the setting? So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Hans Rosling piece, but we don't all have the luxury of being stood up in front of a display, bouncing up and down and pointing out the important things. We're always usually detached and remote from the digestion and consumption of a visualization piece. What are the functional needs? Are you trying to allow people to explore data and find their own stories? Or are you trying to put the story, the main headline, on a plate? And sorry to ruin that puzzle for many of you, but that's where Wall-E actually is. I'm sure that's ruined a lot of weekends. Also, what's the scope for learnability? Some things don't necessarily have to be instant. We don't necessarily have to be instantly capable of reading a piece, so long as we can learn how to. But once again, we don't always have the luxury of having people to spend time to learn how to read a piece. And also on the matter of beauty, I think this is a very important quote from Richard Buckminster Fuller. The idea that we shouldn't set out to achieve beauty, but it should be something that we then judge at the end. Have we achieved it as a consequence of all the decisions that we've made around the story, around the analysis, and around the kind of architecture and execution of the piece? But all this has a very frustrating caveat, which is us, people. People are weird. And this idea, another horse-based idiom, but this idea that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So we can create these very elegant, very effective pieces of information portrayal, but it doesn't mean to say that it will create an impact. It doesn't mean to say that we'll be able to affect people's decisions and actions. People are not rational. We have moods, we have tastes, we have pressures, prejudices, temperaments. Going back to Hebden Bridge, so these are some rather crazy people who, in the middle of January, greeted the naked rambler who was on his way through the UK. Why? Why would you get undressed in the middle of January? There were a few people who didn't quite get the memo. But still, why would we do that? The thing is, we're not all robots. We're not all built the same. We're not all looking for the same thing. We don't have all the same tastes. We're very unique. We're very habitual in some ways. We like very different things. Things connect with us, other things don't. And that is the important thing to be aware of in any visualization project, is that you can only do so much, but ultimately people will always have different reactions to how you portray and develop a visualization piece. So as a subject, we've still got a very long way to go, and the journey really has only just begun. It's a very infant subject matter, but we will get there, and we'll be able to rationalise all these decisions that we have to make. So thank you very much.